in 2015, you were personally involved in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement as a Chinese expert within the Chinese delegation. You witnessed the historic birth of that agreement. From your personal perspective, how did you react when you heard about President Trump's decision to pull out of this agreement?
Yeah, actually, I'm fully surprised and also very, very disappointing for this incorrect decision from President Trump. I think this is something against the historic and the whole world's trends. So this is totally a mistake.
Why can you agree with the kind of justification that President Trump quoted for his decision? For instance, that this is going to cost the United States a lot of money, a lot of jobs, and that climate change is the hoax.
No way. Because I think President Trump's judgment is totally wrong. Why? Because this is something out of the time. Now, for today's world, when the technological revolution, when the new ideas of new views on development, we can see consistency between environmental protection and the economic development. In fact, they are two sides of the one coin. And we can find the commercial opportunities and the new engine of economic growth by environmental protection, by climate mitigation and adaptation.
Mm-hmm. I'm just joined from Boston by Mr. Frank Eckermann, who is principal economist at Synapse Energy Economics, a public interest-oriented consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mr. Eckermann, thank you very much for joining us. Now, President Trump believed that the Paris Agreement will cause job losses and have a negative economic impact on the United States. But in your book, Can We Afford the Future?, you brought up quite the opposite argument. How do you look at whether or not the decision by President Trump is wise or not in an economic sense?
There are all sorts of criteria other than economic which enter the decision about whether it's wise or not. But the idea of job loss from climate policies is almost certainly mistaken. It's been studied repeatedly by many research groups. I led a study about 2 years ago. Over and over again, these studies find that there will be substantial net job gains from renewable energy, from energy efficiency. These are very job-intensive activities. Many of the jobs, the construction jobs in installing these measures, have to be done on site. So it is very hard to see any realistic way that the United States loses jobs on balance from clean energy.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking for allies to fight climate change, California Governor Jerry Brown headed to China together with his counterparts from Washington and New York in a push to build foreign support for carbon-cutting efforts. What could be done in the state level in the United States, and does the federal government pull-out make it more difficult for such actions in the state level?
The federal decision certainly makes it more difficult, but there is a lot that states can do. A lot of energy regulation is done at the state level. California has adopted its own vehicle emission standards, and some number of other states have signed on to the California standards. I think we could see the states that care about this, which are quite a large part of the United States, taking action together. I calculated that if the states that were solidly opposed to Trump were a separate country, they would be the 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, larger than any country in Europe. So it's a substantial group if they ally and stay in tune with the rest of the world on these issues.
Professor Zhou, in China now, the National People's Congress has passed China's first environmental protection tax law in a bid to strengthen the enforcement of environmental regulations. For instance, under the new law, entities will be taxed accordingly for noise, pollution. Companies producing contaminations will pay taxes up to $1,650 per month. It also set rates for stipulated quantities of air and water pollution pollutants and up to $150 for each ton of solid waste and so on and so forth. How important is this law in China's fight against climate change, and what message is China trying to send by such legislation?
I think that's a very important step towards more environmentally friendly institutional capacity building. So that send the message to have incentive to stakeholders, especially the emitting enterprises, to compare their abatement cost and the tax rate, and in general they would do more make more efforts on environmental protection to avoid paying tax. In that way, we have economic incentives to make them protect the environment based on their market behavior.
Mr. Ackerman, I wonder what would be the experience in the United States in terms of such environmental tax. How has such tax could work for the efforts in mitigating the effects of greenhouse emissions? In China, for instance, this is the first, but there are also some economic impact that are being argued. For instance, people are already talking about extra high tax rates in China. Could this tax put even more burden on companies while they absolutely need more competitiveness?
I think it depends on what is done with the revenues and what other policies accompany it. If you simply make it harder for one business to operate and do nothing else, perhaps there's some risk. If you tax pollution and spend the money on cleaner sources of energy, on cleaner industries, you will almost certainly create jobs as well as, of course, enjoying cleaner air and water.
Mr. Zhou, how do you look at this issue when these companies are already claiming that the taxes are too high? Will this new environmental tax put extra burden on the Chinese companies?
I think that's a matter of restructuring of the tax system. In fact, for the moment, as the first steps, this is a transition from the previous emission levy, emission fee, into environmental tax. And furthermore, I believe this is a matter of restructuring tax. That means on some areas the tax burden becomes higher, and meanwhile in other areas the tax burden becomes lower. And as an overall effect, the overall tax burden will be neutral, and this will make the comparative price of the factor inputs into the economy adjusted. That means environmental pollution will be much more expensive because of the scarcity of environmental quality.
Now, Mr. Ackerman, let's talk about some other aspect here. One of the claims Trump used to justify his decision is that climate change is a lie and there will be just a tiny temperature decrease even if the US stays within the Paris Agreement. Is there any scientific evidence for what he said, or is he just missing the point that aiming at a 0.2 degree decrease now is just the thin end of the wedge, and that targets will build on these first steps?
I think that the Paris agreements together accomplish more than 0.02. Maybe that's the effect of the U.S. contribution alone, but the whole point is that if everyone cooperates, we can create some momentum. And yes, more needs to be done, but the science on this is absolutely clear. It's the best researched scientific problem in human history, and the opinions of experts are something like 3,000 to 5 is my sense. And if Trump and some of his allies want to continue quoting those 5 guys, they can, but the rest of the world has moved on. We know that this is necessary.
Mr. Zhou, how will the international community achieve the target of keeping the global average temperature from rising 2 degrees Celsius compared to temperatures of the pre-industrial revolution era by the end of this century, when the world's second largest emitter has walked away from its responsibility?
So the essential approach and to innovate new development paths. That means to change energy mix. To introduce more and more non-fossil fuel. And secondly, to improve the efficiency of energy and the production. And thirdly, to make the economy rely on knowledge and technology more. In institutional terms, we set up the bottom-up target. We call it nationally determined contribution in the context of the Paris Agreement. And then in a period, on the period basis, we can review the performance and the progress to do global stock take. And based on that, we consider how to enhance the ambition and to adjust the, to enhance the targets. In that way, I believe human beings, we can achieve higher and higher targets, and finally we go to our mid-century targets to reduce emission and to protect the climate.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. That was Zhou Ji from the Harbin Institute of Technology and Mr. Frank Ackerman, Principal Economist at the Synapse Energy Economics based in Boston.